Hey guys, Nathan here again. Absurd Being, contributions to philosophy. We'll wrap this up today. Today we're going to talk about being as appropriating event. Just before we get to that, let's review quickly what we looked at last video. We talked about the future ones, and we saw how that was really heavily influenced by Nietzsche. And there were basically two categories of people that Heidegger talked about there: seekers, those who would go down before the second group of people, who are the future ones. And they kind of portrayed it like Nietzsche's Übermensch there. Not that important, I think, but it's there, so I've included it. And we also looked at the last God, which we analysed as moods. And it's, again, I'll just say, I can't remember if I said it then, but Heidegger doesn't talk about gods as moods in contributions, but it seems to be the best way to understand it. I get this from Hubert Dreyfus and Sean Dorrance Kelly in their excellent book, All Things Shining. But the gods kind of function as moods which assail us, they take over us, they're incalculable, invisible. But crucially, and the most important function, is that they disclose a world. It's through these gods as moods that take over. It's through them that a world is revealed. Okay, so let's get into today. We're finishing up with being as appropriating event. So I thought, first of all, I'd just run through what being isn't to get us on track here. So being isn't a being. That's the first thing Heidegger states. So this means that being with a Y can't be an object. Since it's not a being, a particular being, then by definition it can't be an object for us. So it's kind of a big problem, right? I mean, what it means is we can't even conceptualize it. We can't objectify it to form any to come to any understanding about it, or to know it at all. To know something means to posit it conceptually or intellectually as an object, and we can't objectify being with a Y because it's not a being. So that's a big problem. That's the first thing being isn't. It's also not the most general property of beings, which would make it an abstraction. So it's not a general property. This is why Heidegger turned away from using the word ontology. And he also calls this the being of beings, or beingness. So being with a Y is neither of these things. Nor is it, and I've got a quote here, nor is it some immense being, one which would cause all the other presumably known beings and would encompass them in this way or that. So it's not a cause in the way that we typically think of a cause, as in, I think Heidegger is really talking about like a god there, or a supreme being causing other beings. And my last point here, which I've kind of talked about already, is that the way we can't talk of being immediately or directly. We can't talk of it in this way. And this is, first of all, because it can't be an object, so we can't discuss it, we can't talk about it directly. But also, there's a second reason why we can't do this, and that's because every saying arises from being and speaks out of the truth of being. All words, and thereby all logic, stand under the power of being. So the way I think about this is it's kind of like an eye trying to see itself. Right? The eye is that by which we see. And so we can't see the eye kind of pure, in a pure way. We can't see our own eye because we're seeing through our eyes. And so in the same way, we can't talk about being because the words and the language and the logic that we use when we talk all derives from being. So we can't get around, we can't use that to get around kind of and see behind the words and the language and the logic that we're using. Being grounds all of those things. So these are all kind of obstacles to getting at being, to forming some kind of understanding of being. So that's what being isn't. Let's just turn now and see what being is. So the one thing that Heidegger says here a lot, and he repeats it a lot throughout contributions, is beings are. Being is, sorry, let me start again. Beings are, but being essentially occurs. And he says that many places in the book, and it's worth just thinking about that for a minute. Beings are, so beings exist. They are, whereas being doesn't have that. It doesn't exist in the way that beings do. It's not a thing. It isn't in that way. Rather, being essentially occurs. And we'll come back to this idea very shortly, actually. So he talks about being obviously as appropriating event. That's the way he cashes out this word being here. So we can take each of those words individually and break it down that way. Let's start with event. So event, being as appropriating event. What's this event? It's not an event the way we normally mean when we talk about events. So it doesn't have a start point and an end point the way events in the world typically do. So it's more like something that is happening, is occurring all the time, not something that started at a point in time and finished at a point in time. And what Heidegger's emphasizing here, I think, with this word, is the dynamic or active nature of being. It's not something that is, it's something that occurs. It's not a noun, it's a verb. And it's appropriating event. So it's appropriating. What does that mean? We've seen how being appropriates Dasein. That's how we've mainly talked about this. So being needs those who go down and has already appropriated them, assigned them to itself, wherever beings appear. That is the essential occurrence of being itself. We call this essential occurrence the event. Okay, so that's where the appropriating comes in. It appropriates Dasein, and wherever being appropriates Dasein, which we talked about in the video on the grounding, that's where beings appear. And we talked about Dasein as the site of the truth of being. So what's interesting about this appropriation, though, that struck me, is that it gives us a way to understand being, and not the way that a subject understands an object, by positing it and then kind of reflecting on it, because we can't posit being as an object. It isn't a being which can become an object, which we can objectify. But this appropriation, we're appropriated by being, and this process lets us, gives us some insight into what being is, because we're appropriated by it. And we're appropriated by being as thrown projection. So this takes us back to being in time, where we talked about our thrownness, and we talked about projection too, right? So this idea that we are thrown into the world, and we have been thrown by being, because thrownness is our having been appropriated by being. So this throne projection, through this occurrence, we can kind of come to grips a little bit with being itself without actually making it an object for us, without contemplating it without contemplating it in the way that we normally contemplate things, where we make the thing an object for ourselves. Okay, I'm just repeating myself, aren't I, on that point? But basically, that's everything that we've talked about up till now. The way that we've been thrown, the way that being has appropriated us, we've been discussing when we talked about the grounding and actually mainly the grounding, but also a lot of being in time was about that, the way that we've been thrown and the kind of insights we can glean from the fact of our thrownness. So that's being as appropriating event. So Heidegger says some other things that are worth noting here. He says, since beings are the usual, being is the unusual by definition. Okay. And the quote is, in order to know being, we must therefore distance ourselves from all conventionality. Because conventionality is precisely our contribution and our constant pursuit. However, we could never achieve this distancing on our own. Being itself must extract us from beings, i.e., inasmuch as we are immersed in beings, beleaguered by them, being itself must unsettle us, free us from this beleaguering. So again, Heidegger's talking about being, he's talking about being almost as if being is an active agent doing something. It's to get out of, to kind of claw our way out of this encompassing by beings, this having been encompassed by beings in order to get to the truth of being. We need being itself to help us, and being frees us from this beleaguering, from this situation where we're surrounded by beings and kind of trapped, being unable to get beyond beings. But again, Heidegger's not talking about being as an agent, as something like a god or anything like that. There's nothing metaphysical going on here or spiritual. It's more, the way I read this is more like the sun makes us squint when we go outside. So it's not actually trying to do anything. It's not trying to make me squint. But when I go outside, just by its nature, just by what it is, that's the effect it has on me. And I think Heidegger's getting at something similar when he talks about being here. It doesn't actively try and lift us out of our fallen prayness, of our entanglement in beings, but just by nature of what it is, having appropriated us and thrown us into beings, it gives us the way out. It shows us the way out. Again, just by virtue of what it is and how the process has unfolded, how the event has occurred. He also talks about being, the way being always withdraws, and he calls this refusal in Contributions. I don't know if you can hear that, but it's called refusal in Contributions, but and what it is the way that being hides itself, but being doesn't reveal itself, and the way that in this withdrawing, in this refusal, it creates, or it allows the space, it creates the space for, or it allows beings to appear. So it's kind of the mechanism by which beings appear. And that makes me think of what we talked about in What is Metaphysics, annihilation, the annihilation of beings as a whole. And Heidegger talks about that as being the reason why beings appear, because in order for anything to appear, then everything else has to recede, right? Everything else, there has to be some kind of, in order to create that, in order for one being to stand out, then that being has to, let me start again. In order for one being to stand out, other beings have to recede into the background. And that's what annihilation was, and that's what Heidegger talked about in What is Metaphysics. And in talking about this way that the being withdraws, the refusal of being, the way he talks about it here in Contributions, seems to be something similar. And it strikes me that it might even be the same thing from different perspectives. So when we looked at annihilation in What is Metaphysics, it was this process, this event unfolding from a human perspective, or from the perspective of Dasein, where anxiety brought us to this point where beings as a whole recede, and the refusal that we're looking at here is more like from the point of view of being itself, where being itself holds back, withdraws itself in order for individual beings to appear. So I thought that was an interesting parallel anyway between the two. And he goes on to talk about this refusal in a bit more detail. If beings are, then being is not. And this ties in with what we started this video with, the way that being is not a being. Sorry, what was the actual quote there? Yeah, where he talks about a lot. Beings are, being essentially occurs. So beings are, being essentially occurs. Same idea here. If beings are, being is not. So there's a kind of a negation or annihilation or a nothingness bound up with being. Being isn't, it doesn't exist like a being does, like a normal being, like an individual being. Rather, it isn't. But he goes on to say that this doesn't mean that being is therefore destructive or empty, the way that we would normally associate with, if we're talking about beings and something that isn't. That would be something negative or something destructive or empty. Rather, if we think about it in that way, this interprets the non-being of being with a Y as if it were a particular being, as if it were something in the world that we live in, right, in our environment. On the contrary, Heidegger says, being is the origin of all beings. So hopefully that's clear. It always withdraws and it is not. So this idea of refusal at the heart of being. Now he also he mentions something interesting here. He talks about the way that being appropriates Dasein, which we've looked at, but he also says it vibrates right through other beings. So not considering Dasein, considering other beings, it vibrates through them. And this strikes me as being important in a couple of ways. So being is the truth of beings, and its truth, the truth itself, essentially occurs only if sheltered in art, thinking, poetry, deed. So this is interesting because when we typically think about being, it would seem like beings need being, right? You need, this is how beings appear, and this is how I've kind of described being all the way through, that by which beings appear as beings. So on that understanding, on that interpretation, beings need being, but being doesn't need beings. But Heidegger reverses that, actually, when he says this, when he says being as event needs being so that it might essentially occur. Beings do not need being in that way. Beings can still be in the abandonment by being. So it's another take. I think the way to think about this is that, yes, beings need being, because being is that by which beings appear. Without being, I mean, even if beings have been abandoned by being, even if we've forgotten about being itself, it's still happened. It's still taken place, or beings wouldn't appear as beings at all. But there's another way to think about it too, and that's what Heidegger's emphasizing here, that although beings need being to appear, they can still exist in the abandonment by being. So they can still exist as in that machination, and that mode of machination that we talked about right at the beginning. They can still exist as kind of instrumental. We can still treat them. We can see them not as the beings that they are. We can still not relate with them or to them or interact with them authentically. We can see them kind of on a superficial level and interpret them under our own in our own frameworks. But and in that case, the beings kind of stand alone, that they stand abandoned by being, so they don't need being in that way. But there's a deeper level where they obviously, I think, need being to occur. That's what being is. But it is interesting just to see how Heidegger spins it around and says being needs beings, and it essentially occurs through them, through thinking, through poetry, through deed, through art. And if those things were gone, if those manifestations of if those different manifestations weren't around, weren't available to us, then our access to being itself would also be gone. So I think that's what Heidegger's getting at here. They remain before us as things or tools, implements we fail to see to the heart of. And that's what Heidegger calls inceptual thought, is this attempt to see things in a new light, in the light of the truth of being. And so hopefully that makes some sense. My laptop's just turned off, which is not good. Okay, but we're coming to the end of this video now. I just wanted to give a brief summary of, Heidegger gives a summary, and I've kind of summarized his summary. And he lists 8 features that make up the event of being, and each one kind of connects to the one following. So it sounds like this, it looks like this. The first one is appropriation, which we've talked about in great detail. Second one, appropriation includes the decision. And if you remember, we talked about this decision between, it's the ultimate decision, not a relative decision that we make between different beings, but it's the foundational decision between being and non-being. But remember, because non-being is a mode of being itself, ultimately the decision is between being and indifference. But then we saw that being and indifference is actually already decidedness, because it already belongs to being itself. So there was a whole chain of reasoning. I think it was in the very first video in this series. Number 3 is appropriation, is the way that appropriation as decision brings the separated ones into the encounter. Remember the encounter between gods and humans, and was it earth and world, which was strife. So that encounter, we saw in the grounding the way that encountering allows or creates the space for beings to appear. Number 4, encounter leads to strife, and strife essentially occurs by unsettling beings from their lostness in mere beingness. We talked about this briefly when we talked about the unusualness of being. So remember, we talked about the way that being pulls us out from our lostness in being, and it does this by unsettling beings through strife. So again, not as an agent doing something, but it just as what it is. By virtue of what it is, it helps us. It helps free us from our lostness in beings. Number 5, unsettling is simultaneously the withdrawal. We talked about that as the refusal. 6, being is structured and without image, resting in this simplicity. So by nature, it lacks any of the complicating features that make up individual beings. It's simple. It's basically structured and lacks image. It's not an object. Number 7, the simplicity of being is marked by uniqueness, and this uniqueness does not occur in relation to anything else, i.e. any other being. Okay, because there are no other beings. Being is at a level beneath that, so it's only one. And also, number 8, the uniqueness of being grounds its solitude, in accord with which being casts round about itself only nothingness. So being solitary, being occurs in relation to beings only through the strife of world and earth, only through Dasein and the grounding that we've talked about a lot. Okay, so that's basically being as appropriating event. I have one last short summary to throw up, and this is just briefly recounting what the highlights of this video. So we talked about the way that being isn't a being, and therefore it's not. We can't objectify it. It can't be an object, and we can't talk about it either for that same reason. Also, it's not the most general property of being, so it's nothing to do with what Heidegger calls ontology. And it's not a cause, it's not a supreme being causing things, causing other beings. Yeah, the way that being allows beings to appear or discloses beings is not by causing them. We also looked, being can't be talked about directly, which I've mentioned already. And finally, being is the appropriating event, and we went into some detail about that. Yeah, I'm sorry if you heard that. That's my kind of AI, Korean AI. It's like a Alexa equivalent over here. So it just, I don't know what, it's just talking about stuff over there. Anyway, if you can't hear it, I'm going to sound crazy, but there was this Alexa type thing just talking about how it can't connect to the internet or something. So hopefully it wasn't too loud. Now the last thing I have, always last things, I've got lots of last things here. I wanted to just put up a kind of summary of the whole of contributions, everything that we've looked at to date in this video series. And the summary looks like this. And I'll just run through it briefly. We've kind of looked at it in each video, or in some of the videos anyway. We've covered it. But we started with the resonating, and the way that this leads to the interplay, and then this is the way that the interplay is accomplished in the leap, and the leap revealed to us the grounding. And really the grounding was where the meat of contributions lies. That's where a lot of the kind of the details of how being occurs were covered. And then at the bottom there, we've got being as appropriating event, which is recognized, or which occurs in the encounter between humans and gods, known in throne projection and is sheltered in beings. And this is known to the future ones, which was we saw as kind of the Nietzschean Übermensch idea, and is known through the last God, which disclosed a world, which revealed the world through its moods. Through that, being occurs as the grounding, and then we're back to the meat of the book. So the one thing I did want to draw your attention to is the way that kind of I've conceptualized this is the top half of that diagram moves down. So we start with the resonating, and the idea here for me was that we start with the resonating, and this is how we get to an understanding of the grounding, being in the grounding. So we start with the resonating, where we realize we've forgotten being. This leads us to the interplay and the transition. We transition from the first beginning to the other beginning, accomplished in the leap, and this gets us to the grounding. So that reveals the grounding. Whereas from the bottom, we've got being as appropriating event, and that is, and these upward moving arrows are kind of the way that being occurs, I guess, as event. So being is known to the future ones, who through the last God, being occurs as the grounding, and that again is kind of the meeting point. So this is the way that I've kind of come to an understanding of what Heidegger is talking about in contributions. So that's kind of where contributions is. That's where I am in relation to contributions. Hopefully that has made some kind of sense. If you haven't read it, it's worth reading. It's a difficult book, but like I say, this diagram that I've finished with is so it's just a great overview of Heidegger's post-being and time thought, which I haven't come across in any of the other lectures that he's given, or any of the other essays that he's written or articles he's written. I haven't seen kind of this comprehensive picture, this roadmap laid out before. So I really did get a lot from this. And I just wanted to finish with another last thing. I wanted to give Heidegger the last word here, I found a summary of being as appropriating event. I found a summary that kind of brings everything together, actually. It incorporates a lot of the things that we've talked about in this video series. Are they concrete ideas? Probably not. When I read the quote out and put it on the screen, it is nice and tidy, and many of the ideas that we've talked about are included, but it's not really. It's just not. It's not something you can read and say, now I get it, and that's because it really is. It's kind of poetic. It's metaphorical, and that really is the way that Heidegger operates at this in his post-Beyng and time work. And I think ultimately it's the only way that Heidegger can operate, because remember, we're talking about something that we can't even talk about directly. We can't posit as an object. We can't objectify it in any way. So the only way for us to come to grips with it is through this poetic, metaphorical, illogical, irrational approach. And so anyway, I'll stick the quote up. I'll read it out, and that'll be my last word on contributions. So thanks for listening. If you've stuck around to the end, I hope that it's clarified things. If it hasn't, or if I've gone astray anywhere that you've spotted, let me know in the comments, and I always respond to comments. It's been great to see the comments that I've gotten, so thanks for that. It's really fantastic for me in doing these. Anyway, I'll leave it to Heidegger, and thanks for listening, and I'll see you for the next series. Being is the conflictual appropriation which originarily gathers that which is appropriated in it, the Dasein of the human being, and that which is refused in it, God, into the abyss of its between. In the clearing of the between, world and earth contest the belonging of their essence to the field of time-space, wherein what is true comes to be preserved.